On the 31st of October in the year 2022, an Egyptian field archaeologist named Ashraf Omar Ali was working a dry stretch of limestone on a plateau roughly 3 kilometers west of the Valley of the Kings. Beneath his feet, where the ground should have felt like the hard, unyielding bedrock of the Theban hills, he noticed something else. A softness, a faint hollowness, the sensation every excavator both dreads and dreams about. He called over his colleague, Haraji Syed Ahmed, and the two men knelt in the dust and began to probe the surface with their hands. And the ground gave. The late afternoon light lay long and gold across the cliffs, and for a moment there was only the ordinary quality of the desert at evening, the silence of a site that had held its secret without complaint for a very long time. Somewhere beneath this unremarkable patch of ground, tucked beneath the path of a seasonal Theban waterfall, lay an entrance that had not been opened in more than 3,000 years, leading down into a chamber whose owner had spent the longest portion of recorded history without a tomb. For more than 100 years of systematic excavation, since Petrie's first surveys of the Theban necropolis in the 1880s, no one had thought to search here. This site sat closer to the Valley of the Queens, and when archaeologists first considered it, they wondered whether it might belong to one of the pharaoh's wives rather than a king. The team was headed by Dr. Piers Litherland, director of an Egyptian-British mission, and this was no lucky stumble in the dark, but the culmination of decades of patient, methodical work by a man who had built an entire career on a single, stubborn conviction. He believed the missing tomb was out there, not lost, not destroyed, simply overlooked, waiting somewhere the century of Egyptology before him had never bothered to look. What Litherland had been chasing was the last missing royal tomb of the 18th dynasty, the one remaining gap in a catalog that scholars had long believed was very nearly complete. Every other king of that famous line had been accounted for, their resting places mapped, cataloged, and studied. All but one. The tomb they had found belonged to Thutmose II, the fourth pharaoh of the dynasty, a figure the historical record has treated almost as an afterthought. The last time a new kingdom royal tomb had been found was in 1922, when Howard Carter's team broke the seal on KV-62, meaning this particular gap in the record had persisted for more than 100 years. And so, when the team finally broke through and passed into the tomb of Thutmose II, they carried their lights into a space no living eye had seen in 3.5 millennia. What their lamps revealed were plastered walls, a ceiling painted deep blue and scattered with yellow stars, and, among the debris on the floor, fragments of alabaster jars bearing carved inscriptions. But the chamber built to hold eternity was almost entirely bare. And this was the first quiet note of a mystery that would deepen with every step deeper into the dark. The tomb, it seemed, had been emptied, deliberately, anciently, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The 18th dynasty produced some of the most famous names ever carved into stone, a density of royal achievement that few periods in the ancient world can match. Thutmose III, the warrior pharaoh who fought 17 campaigns in 20 years and whose battle records at Karnak still constitute the most detailed military annals in the Egyptian archive. There was Hatshepsut, one of the very few women ever to rule Egypt as king in her own right, and later still would come Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the boy whose golden mask the whole world knows. And among all these colossi stood a fourth pharaoh who occupies a space that is almost architecturally invisible, a name most people have never once heard spoken aloud. His name was Thutmose II. And he was never supposed to be king at all, because ahead of him in the line of succession stood two elder brothers who should each have inherited their father's throne before him. Those brothers were Wajmos and Amenmos, and both of them died before they could ascend, their deaths clearing a path that no one had ever intended a younger, frailer son to walk. So a young man of uncertain status and apparently uncertain health found himself lifted, almost by accident, into the role of the fourth pharaoh of the dynasty. But here is where the historical record begins to fail us in ways that unsettle every attempt to write his story with confidence. Egyptologists have never resolved whether Thutmose II reigned for 14 years, following the low chronology from 1493 to 1479 BC, or for as few as 3, under the high chronology beginning around 1482. This is not a trivial footnote, but a fault line running through everything, because it changes how much of what was built in his name he actually built, and how much was later work assigned to a convenient royal identity. And the person most likely to have benefited from that convenient identity was his own half-sister and wife, a woman named Hatshepsut, whose blood ran with more royalty than his own. She was the daughter of Thutmose I by his great royal wife, which made her, by the strict arithmetic of dynastic legitimacy, of higher standing than the very king she had married. The political implications of that asymmetry were profound, and they would only deepen in the years after his death, when she stepped fully into the light and he receded into it. For a long time, scholars assumed that Hatshepsut had deliberately erased her dead husband from his monuments, a calculated act of damnatio memoriae meant to blot his name from history. But modern scholarship has complicated that picture considerably, because several analysts point out that Hatshepsut had every reason to protect and invoke his memory, since her own claim to power flowed directly through him. If you find yourself leaning in as this story turns, that quiet pull toward the forgotten and the overlooked is exactly what keeps this channel going. Which brings us at last to the man himself, to a body pulled from the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari in 1881 and identified on the evidence available as Thutmose II. The mummy carries that suffering in its very proportions: the bald crown, the contracted tendons, the emaciation of a man whose body seems to have consumed itself long before it stopped. This was not a man who had lived easily, but one worn down by chronic illness, who seems to have struggled against his own body long before it finally failed him. And yet buried inside this identification lies a problem that would grow into the deepest question of all, because the body has been consistently assessed as older than 30 at the time of death. The trouble is that the historical record, imprecise as it is, suggests Thutmose II died well before reaching that age, and possibly considerably younger. He died young then, possibly diseased, possibly after only a handful of years on the throne, and yet his tomb was not stripped bare by thieves in the night. It was emptied by the state itself. When the excavators finally moved through the passages, they found a chamber built around an early variation of a left-turning bent axis, a design that would echo through the dynasty for generations to come. The walls carried passages from the Amduat, the royal funerary text that mapped the king's passage through the 12 hours of the night, a chart drawn for the dead to follow from sunset toward the promise of dawn. Above it all, on plaster fragments scattered across the floor, was the night sky itself. That same painted firmament, its deep blue and yellow stars already glimpsed when the team first entered, now revealed in detail as it lay broken at their feet. And yet the chamber was almost entirely empty. What remained were fragments of alabaster jars, inscribed with the names of Thutmose II and of Hatshepsut, the first objects ever archaeologically linked to this king's internment. These fragments were, in the words of Mohammed Khaled, Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, items found for the first time, for whom there is no funerary furniture in museums around the world. For more than 3,000 years, no piece of this king's burial had existed anywhere on Earth that we could point to and name. Now, an emptied royal chamber almost always tells a familiar story. The story of robbery, of mummies torn from their wrappings, of bandages left astray and Shabti figurines smashed in the scramble for gold. But Litherland does not believe this tomb was ever looted, because the unmistakable signs of plunder, the violence, the disorder, the scatter pattern of a ransacking, are entirely, conspicuously absent. Instead, the evidence points towards something far stranger: an official removal, carried out with care by priests acting on behalf of the state, roughly 6 years after the king was first laid to rest in 1473 BC. This was not an unusual practice in the New Kingdom, where the priesthood periodically relocated royal remains and grave goods during periods of instability or when a tomb itself had begun to fail. And this tomb had a fatal weakness, because it lay beneath a seasonal Theban waterfall, exposed to flood damage that may have driven the decision to carry everything out before the water could ruin it. Wide shot. Theban necropolis hills at dusk, unexcavated slopes, long shadows across sand. Which raises a question that has haunted the excavation ever since. Where did they take it all? Litherland believes the grave goods were reinterred in a second tomb, tucked somewhere closer to Thebes, and that this secondary chamber has never been excavated, never opened, never seen since the New Kingdom. Somewhere beneath these hills, in other words, a sealed chamber may hold the complete funerary furniture of a pharaoh, untouched for 3,500 years. That same left-turning bent-axis corridor we walked through in the burial chamber was not merely a local solution. Litherland's analysis shows it propagated across the 18th Dynasty's building program as the standard template for royal interment. Even the tomb that defined Egyptology for a century borrowed its structural logic from the one pharaoh the century of Egyptology before it had failed to find. The possessions were carried away into a darkness that 3.5 millennia have not yet lifted. To understand the strangest possibility this discovery raises, we have to travel back to the summer of 1881, to a hidden recess cut into the cliff face at Deir el-Bahari. For years, a local family had been quietly selling antiquities that could only have come from a royal burial, and when the authorities finally traced the source, they found a corridor packed with the relocated bodies of dozens of New Kingdom pharaohs. These kings had been gathered here by priests during the late New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period, an age when tomb robbing had grown so rampant that the state moved its dead sovereigns into hiding to protect them. And among these gathered kings lay a body that would, in the years that followed, be catalogued and labeled with a name: Thutmose II. The body repeats, in clinical detail, everything the earlier examination suggested. The same bald crown, the same contracted frame. But here, examined against the new context of the tomb's discovery, those details carry a different weight. Whatever this man endured, the embalmers could not remove the traces of it, and the disease that ended his life seems to have written itself into his flesh in ways no ritual could erase. Whatever the limits of his reign, this was a human body that had struggled. But here is where the certainty begins to dissolve, because the body was assigned to Thutmose II on the basis of where it lay and the inscriptions found near it, not from any secure biological proof. And when modern anatomists and radiologists examined the remains, they returned again and again to the same conclusion: that this individual had died past the age of 30. And yet the documentary record, fragmentary as it remains, points stubbornly toward a man who never reached that threshold. Perhaps never came close, because a man who died past 30 cannot easily be reconciled with a pharaoh who almost certainly did not. And if the identification is wrong, the label in that Cairo gallery has read the wrong name for over 100 years. And if his hypothesized second tomb exists somewhere beneath the Theban hills, with its chamber still sealed, then the true remains of the king may be lying there yet, untouched, unopened, waiting in the dark. Consider what that would mean, because it would mean that somewhere in Cairo, a pharaoh has been displayed for well over a century under a name that was never his own. A stranger, resting under a borrowed king's title. And yet we cannot resolve this cleanly, because the DNA analysis and the radiological evidence remain, as of now, genuinely inconclusive on the question of who this body truly is. It is one of the most honestly open problems in Egyptology today, a puzzle that no amount of dramatic certainty is permitted to close. So consider the full shape of this forgotten life. A man who was never meant to be king, who ruled for a span we cannot precisely measure, who died of a disease we cannot name. A man whose tomb was emptied before anyone could forget him, and whose body, if it is even in Cairo, we are no longer certain we recognize. And yet, to measure this king only by what has been lost from his record is to miss the strange gravity he exerted on everything that came after him. Because whatever the brevity of his reign, Thutmose II fathered a son with a secondary wife, a boy named Thutmose III, who would one day become the greatest warrior king that Egypt ever produced. And by dying young enough that this heir was still an infant, he left behind a power vacuum into which stepped a woman of higher royal blood than his own, his half-sister and wife, Hatshepsut. What followed was one of the most consequential reigns in all of Egyptian history, measured in stone that still stands today. Hatshepsut sent a 5-ship trade expedition to Punt, recorded in such detail at Deir el-Bahari that botanists have since identified the myrrh trees carried back live in their root balls, and raised 2 red granite obelisks at Karnak, each over 29 meters tall, still the tallest standing in Egypt. None of it could have happened as it did without the precise manner and timing of one forgotten man's death. His greatest gift to history may have been the way he left it. But the tomb beneath the Theban waterfall carries a second legacy beyond the man himself, pressed into the very geometry of its passages, in the left-turning bent-axis corridor that, as Litherland showed, his builders laid down here before anyone else. That corridor plan rippled forward through 2 centuries of royal construction, the same turning, the same axis, until it reached at last the burial that the whole world now knows. A quiet thread of continuity, the most visited tomb on Earth shaped in part by the blueprints of the most invisible one. And now, for the first time in more than 3,000 years, the objects from this king's burial can actually be studied. For the first time, the architecture can be measured, the inscriptions read, and the thin historical record of his reign supplemented at last with material evidence carved in stone. Evidence that proves he was here, that he was buried with ceremony and intention, that someone cared enough to give him a proper passage into the afterlife. And threading through all of it, the bare floor, the scattered plaster, the alabaster shards, the amduat still runs across the walls, its columns of figures undimmed, still charting the passage it was made to chart. Hour by hour, the solar bark moves through serpent-guarded gates and chambers of the dead, towed by a crew of gods toward the one moment the whole journey is built around. The instant the eastern horizon breaks open and the sun reappears. Imagine lying in the silence of that chamber, the amduat moving across the walls, the solar bark pulling through its dark hours above you. The whole architecture of the tomb a machine for resurrection, set in motion the moment the door was sealed. He waited 3,500 years for someone to find the doorway, for a hand to press against soft ground and feel it give way. And perhaps in a sealed chamber we have not yet found, the body we have been misidentifying in Cairo for 140 years. The forgotten king of a glittering dynasty, buried beneath a waterfall, waiting still for the dawn his tomb was built to promise him.